Welcome back to the second hour of our program. We'll continue our conversations about last night's State of the Union address, but there are a few other things in the news and things that I wanted to share with you. Last night, one of the main attack points on Biden, it happened when he talked about fentanyl, it happened when he talked about the border, it happened when he talked about immigration, was Republicans in the audience catcalling him, screaming out, "Secure the border!" It happens multiple times. So I think it's pretty important that we go back and look at what happened the last time Republicans were in charge of securing the border. What did they do? Well, they had a big new idea. Hey, we've got the solution to the problem. It's going to stop immigration. These immigrants are just going to stop coming to America if we do this. It was apparently Stephen Miller's idea. He called together a whole bunch of senior Trump administration officials to put it into place. And the plan was to tear children from their parents. Let that sink in for a minute. Tearing children from their parents. Louise and I have 3 kids. I can't imagine what it would feel like if government officials came to us and took one of our children, particularly when they were young. Particularly if it was for something that I might have thought I did, like applying for immigration, applying for asylum. These were not people who were arrested illegally in the United States. These were people who showed up at a border point of entry and said, "I am requesting asylum." And they were taken in to be processed. They were separated for their children. "Oh, we have to have a private interview with you." And while they were separated, their children were stolen. And when they finished the interview, they came out, "Where's my child? Where's my child?" Can you imagine? Last week, the Biden administration announced that they, out of the 3,924 children that we know have been brutally ripped from their mothers' and fathers' arms, they had found 2,926 of them, and there are still 998, almost 1,000 of these children that the Trump administration trafficked into God only knows where. I don't know why QAnon isn't all over this. They seem to be all about the children, right? Nearly 1,000 children still missing, stolen from their parents by the Trump administration, by Stephen Miller, by Christian Nelson, by Nielsen, by John Kelly. This is a crime. You know, Joe Stalin said, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And our media seems to deal with this like it's a statistic. Oh, it's 3,200 kids. 3,900 kids, excuse me. No, every single one of them is an individual human being, a child. Physicians for Human Rights got access to a couple of dozen of these parents and their children after they were reunited. And they wrote a report about it. There's a link to it over at hartmannreport.com today in my article about this. They wrote, due to the targeted acts of, first of all, just imagine for a moment, wherever you live, what would it take? How bad would life have to be around you? How many of your neighbors would have to threaten to kick in your door or burn your house down or rob you or rape your kids? How bad would it have to get to make you take your most valuable possessions, put them in a single backpack, and leave everything else behind with child in tow and walk for days to get to another country to find safety? What would it take? Physicians for Human Rights writes, due to the targeted acts of violence, all parents arrived at the U.S. border already having been exposed to trauma, most often as victims of gang activity, from death threats, physical assaults, relatives killed, extortion, sexual assault, or robbery. All parents expressed fear that their child would be harmed or killed if they stayed in their home country. In almost all cases, their children had already faced severe harm before fleeing. Gangs drugged kidnapped, poisoned, and threatened children, including threats of death, violence, or kidnapping if they or their parents did not comply with the gang's demands. Parents were confident that the journey to the United States would result in protection for their children. End of quote. But they didn't find protection here. Instead, they found a new gang, this one wearing uniforms, who stole their children. Again, Physicians for Human Rights. When they arrived in the United States, however, parents reported that immigration authorities forcibly removed children from their parents' arms, removed parents while their children slept, or simply disappeared the children while their parents were in courtrooms or receiving medical care. Almost all reported that immigration authorities failed to provide any explanation as to why they were being separated, where their family members were being sent, and if or how they would be reunited. In addition, the asylum narratives documented instances of parents who were taunted and mocked by immigration authorities when asked for the whereabouts of their children. Can you imagine? They go on to note, PHR clinicians chronicled that nearly everyone interviewed exhibited symptoms and behaviors consistent with trauma and its effects, being confused and upset, constantly worried, crying a lot, having sleep difficulties, not eating well, having nightmares, being preoccupied, having severely depressed moods, overwhelming symptoms of anxiety, and physiological manifestations of panic and despair, racing heart, shortness of breath, headaches, feeling pure agony and hopelessness, feeling emotional and mental anguish, and being incredibly despondent. The evaluating clinicians noted that the children exhibited reactions that included regression in age-appropriate behaviors, crying, not eating, having nightmares and other sleeping difficulties, loss of developmental milestones, as well as clinging to parents and feeling scared following reunification with their parents. This is torture. The United Nations identifies torture, this was the 1984 Convention Against Torture, as an act which, number one, causes severe physical or mental suffering, number two, is done intentionally, number three, is done for the purpose of coercion, punishment, intimidation, or for a discriminatory reason, and number four, by a state official or with state consent or acquiescence. It is a crime. And it's a crime that was no accident. In May of 2018, Stephen Miller pulled together a group of senior officials at the White House. He said that they needed to use torture to discourage people from showing up at the border. He said too many brown people were entering our majority white country, or words to that effect. In fact, the actual quote that Julia Ainsley and Jacob Soboroff got from two people who were at the meeting was that Stephen Miller said, quote, "If we don't enforce this, it is the end of our country as we know it." In other words, we're no longer an all-white nation, or majority white. The meeting calendar says that the attendees included Jeff Sessions, Kirstjen Nielsen, Stephen Miller, Mike Pompeo, Alex Azar, John Rood, John Kelly, Chris Liddell, Don McGahn, and Mark Short, who went on to be the vice president's chief of staff. After Miller's sales pitch, he demanded a show of hands. The only person who didn't raise their hand and say, yes, I'm okay with this, was Kirstjen Nielsen. But she later defended the policy and actually put it into place. These people were all in on this crime. And by the way, it's not just an international crime. Section 2340A of Title 18 U.S. Code prohibits torture committed by the American public officials under the color of law against persons within that official's custody or control. All of these people, they were in on the crime, they committed the crime, they should all be facing a prosecutor and a jury of their peers. Now, it's important to put this in context. This is not the first time white people in America have visited horrors upon non-white people. We had horrific acts of slavery, the slaughter of Native Americans, a century of separate but equal. We interned Japanese Americans in the 1940s. But the people who were responsible for those crimes are all dead now. But this time, we have an opportunity to right a crime committed in the immediate past while all the co-conspirators and perpetrators are still alive. Is Merrick Garland going to have the courage to prosecute these people? Will federal prosecutors go after them? Will justice finally be served so that future administrations will think long and hard before using torture as a policy tool? This is worth calling your senators and members of Congress about. The children who were separated from their families, there's still 1,000 of them missing. This is kidnapping. This is criminal. These people need to be held to account. 202-224-3121 is the number for the Congressional Switchboard, 202-224-3121. And don't forget to reach out to your favorite media outlets on social media.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Ask them why they're not covering this story better. This crime was committed in our names with our tax dollars. We must respond.